Thank you for your patience. I think we will now make a start. Talofa lava, Maloi Lele. I would like to welcome you all to the Pacific webinar on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, 6th Assessment Report, an overview of impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability for the Pacific. Reverend Yese Wele, Honorable Minister for Ministry of Natural Resources and Environment and Samoa Tourism Authority, Toisulu Sulu Cedric Schuster, distinguished members, Chief Executive Officers of Government Ministries, the Australian National University, which is our partner to deliver this webinar, the representative of government and non-government organizations, representatives of regional organizations and UN agencies, ladies and gentlemen. Again, Maloi Lele, Maloi Tautemak Hefiafini. It is a pleasure to receive you here today, both online and also here at the Pacific Climate Change Center. Without further ado, and as usual in our Pacific way, we will start our program with a word of prayer. And I would like to invite Reverend Yese Wele of the Vayala Congregational Christian Church to please lead the meeting in prayer. Thank you.
Let us worship God. Bible reading is taken from the book of Genesis, chapter 1, part of verse 11 and 12. Let us hear the word of God. Then God said, let the earth put forth vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees of every kind on earth, and bear fruit in it. And it was so. And God saw it was good. The story of creation in the Bible indicates that Almighty God, the Creator, has created Earth and the universe in excellent condition. He created the land to naturally pour out flourishing nature for all creatures. The water naturally pours out to many kinds of living beings, and the air filled with birds. Light and darkness and the clear dome. God himself saw that different aspects of the created order was good. This means that God saw and created a good, safe, and flourishing home for all creatures from the beginning. There is no doubt that how we see creation determines how we respond to it. If we see creation as something that has an integral and essential worth, we will treat it differently than if we merely see it as something that has some value to humanity. If we see creation as something that satisfies our desires and demanding business needs, nature and creation will be something different. Creation should not be seen and understood primarily in terms of a provider of goods and services, but we must see it as a home for all humanity to live now and generations to come. It must be a secure and safe place for us all. It must be well preserved for our children and future generations. God, from the beginning, in the book of Genesis, commanded Adam, a representative of humanity, to be fruitful and to become stewards of the land and his world. Fruitful and stewardness of the land is not the destruction of natural resources, neither elimination of future life, but to mediate God's creation's blessings to earth and stand in a creative relationship with the rest of the creation. Climate change indicates the creation has changed, and as a result, its negative impacts will greatly affect our living beings. Today's discussions is beneficial in many respects, including how we should see and view Earth and creation for us all, including recognizing impacts of climate change, adaptation, and vulnerabilities, as well as considering options for sustainable future. In doing so, we need to see the creation for what it is, essential and integral, and work together to continue to make our world safe and good. Let us pray that the divine spirit of Holy God fulfill and be in fruition in this occasion. Let us all ask God Almighty to place and establish in our hearts good vision, clear thinking, and fruitful throughout today's important discussion, conversations, and deliberations. We ask the Holy Spirit to be with us, open our hearts so we see and implement ways to live in a stable, secure, peaceful, and preserved environment now and the future. Let us pray. God Almighty, God the Creator, Sustainer, and the Redeemer of the universe, we gather together today to discuss and deliberate on ways to improve our understanding on effects of climate change in our daily lives and in the future. We pray that you bless all partners and participants of today's webinar with knowledge and understanding. Fill our minds with your wisdom, Father, and instill in our hearts your will, so we can see and deliberate on all things good for our environment and formulate ways to be resilient on climate change and live sustainably in your creation. We ask God that you enlighten the world and its leaders in your divine purpose of creation, so that we live peacefully with one another and with your creation. We ask, Father, that these discussions empower and enrich us in our partners and us all to see ways that will preserve and benefit nature and your creation. We ask that you bless all partners, donors, all those who are involved in making this event and occasion possible. Bless us all. We pray in the name of Jesus Christ, our Lord. May the peace and love of the Father, the Son, and the whole never-ending fellowship with you, Holy Spirit, be upon us now and forevermore. Amen.
Malo apito Faftailava, Reverend Yese Wele, for the encouraging words and for the prayer and blessing of the program today. It is appreciated. I will now call on the Director General of SPREP, who is joining us from Aotearoa, Leota Kosilatu, for your welcoming remarks. Thank you, Director General. You have the floor. Sorry, Director General. Can you unmute, please? Thank you.
Yes. Hello, Pito, Ofa. Thank you very much for your welcoming remarks. Good afternoon, Talofa, Malolele, greetings, kia ora from Auckland. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge the words of encouragement from Reverend Yese Wele this morning. And I also acknowledge the Honourable Minister, the Ministry of Environment and Natural Resources of the Government of Samoa, Laufionga, Sulu, Cedric Schuster, members of the Diplomatic Corps, distinguished partners, crop agencies, UN representatives, and I'd like to especially welcome and acknowledge all of the distinguished representatives of our member countries who are joining us virtually this afternoon. Can I also acknowledge the University of Australian National University through Professor Mark Howden, the Vice Chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and Director of the Institute for Climate, Energy, and Disaster Solutions. Ladies and gentlemen, Talofa and Malolele, and it's a pleasure for me to say a few words on behalf of SPREP, and in doing so, I welcome you all to the Climate Change Center, those who are joining us at the SPREP HQ, and those who are joining us virtually. Welcome to this webinar titled the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change 6 Assessment Report, which deals with the assessment of impacts, adaptation, vulnerabilities. And we are doing this in partnership with the Australian National University. First of all, I'd like to perhaps maybe extend some thoughts and prayers to the region and to especially our member countries who have been continuously affected by COVID-19. We've seen the transmission of this pandemic being widespread right throughout the region. Many of our countries are having to deal with this, and so we want to remember them during this time. But that's not the only challenge that is facing us. We also want to remember Tonga as they continue to travel this difficult road of recovery after the Hunga Tonga Hunga Hapai volcanic eruption and tsunami in January. And so our thoughts with them as they continue to pick up the pieces and continue on this difficult road of recovery. But also let us remember our friends and the people of Australia, particularly those around the East Coast, New South Wales, and also Queensland, who have been affected by serious flooding in the last 2 weeks. Our heartfelt thoughts are with them, particularly for those who have lost lives of their loved ones. Let us remember them during this very difficult time. So I've said those words in context because that's the context in which we are having this webinar, although the focus is on the Ipcc Working Group 2 report. I think it highlights the vulnerability of the Pacific region. But let me now focus on the objective of this workshop. So many of you are aware that last week, 27th of February, the Ipcc Working Group 2 report was released, which, as I mentioned earlier, assesses the impacts and the adaptation and vulnerabilities related to climate change. This report recognizes the interdependence of climate, ecosystems, biodiversity, and human societies, and seeks to integrate knowledge more strongly right across a whole range of sectors that includes the natural, ecological, social, and economic sciences. And builds on, more importantly, on the earlier Ipcc reports. The message from this report is very, very clear and reinforces some of the key messages from the other Ipcc reports, and that is we cannot afford to delay any further. It cannot be business as usual. We have very little time for action, and we need to act now, and we need to act bold, and we need to do it as soon as possible. And also, I think the message is very clear that climate change is everybody's business. Everybody's got a part to play in taking urgent action, whether it be the big countries, the developing countries, and for us here in the Pacific, who are the most vulnerable and are at the front line when it comes to experiencing the adverse impacts of climate change. And as I said, the message is very clear, and it's not something new. We have been advocating as a region for many, many years during the previous COPs, and the most recent one was at Glasgow COP26, where again, the Pacific, led by our political champions, advocated for urgent action. And given the science that we now know of, the message from us as a region has been not only ongoing, but very clear that we need to act now. So coming to the report, I'll just mention maybe one or two key points. Not only does it reinforces the importance of science, but the science spells out the alarming consequences due to human-induced action, which has caused dangerous and widespread disruption. And it's affecting our lives. We're seeing it today. We're seeing it here in the Pacific. You know, we're seeing it everywhere. In Australia, one part of the country is facing floods, and the other part of Australia are facing, looking at near drought conditions. And these are circumstances that are being made worse by human intervention. And it's happening not just in one country, but right throughout the world. And what's worrying about this report is that, you know, it is the most vulnerable people and the most vulnerable ecosystems. And that speaks of us here in the Pacific. It is us as the most vulnerable people and our vulnerable ecosystems that will be hit even more so if we do not act. We need to keep on the 1.5 degrees Celsius pathway in order for us to avoid catastrophic effects on not just on the Pacific Island countries, but on the whole world. We stand to lose many of our islands due to sea level rise and the loss of people, our cultures, our livelihoods, and so forth. So this is the message that we have been conveying to the global community for many, many years. And the science keeps telling us that this is what's happening. And the science tells us that we have got very little time to act, and we need to act now. We all know about the vulnerability of the Pacific, you know, to natural disasters. I've already mentioned a few in my opening remarks, but you know, the science that we have now, including this recent report, suggests that the intensity in particular of concerns, which is something that's of specific concern to the Pacific, the cyclones are predicted to not only increase, but also to increase in intensity and frequency. So that's not very good news for us. We know that we've been experiencing some of the most intense cyclones in the past couple of years. We've seen it in Fiji, we've seen it in Vanuatu, we've seen it in Tonga, Samoa, Vanuatu, name it, we've seen it. And so we are not passive here in the Pacific, even though our emissions are very, very small. We're not passive. We've been active in terms of not just advocacy, but taking the lead in terms of adopting renewable energy, making sure that our energy roadmaps will ensure that we will reach 100% targets of renewable energy before 2030. Some of us are almost there. And so the problem is not, of course, on us, but we are doing what we can in order to help what is a global problem. We know that in the Pacific, we have been making calls, you know, to the global community to take such similar actions so that we will maintain the 1.5 degrees pathway. We've been pioneering through innovative adaptation practices that are already being implemented and documented replicated in some of our member countries. And the Pacific Climate Change Center, which is hosted here by SPREP, continues to work in partnership with our partners, our member countries, on its mandate to coordinate climate change action in the Pacific. I'd like to acknowledge, as I close, the partnership with all of our member countries. I'd like to acknowledge, in particular for this webinar, Australian National University. And I'd like to thank Professor Mark Howden, who's also joining us today and is the Vice Chair of the Working Group 2 for this report. So thank you very much, Professor, for joining us. I also want to acknowledge the government of Japan and the government of New Zealand, who have been very active development partners, not just for the region, but for SPREP especially, in terms of the work that we're doing through the Pacific Climate Change Center. Without this support, it's not possible for us to progress some of the very important climate actions that we are working on. We also want to acknowledge all the research institutions, our CROC partners, the UN, private sector, for all the work that we're trying to do together. And that's what it should be. As I mentioned, climate change is a global problem, and we must all have an interest to make sure that we are all part of the solution. Thank you very much. I wish you all the best. And once again, malo pito, and good afternoon.
Fafitaitele, Director General, for your remarks, and of course for reinforcing the message of the IPCC report, as well as our Pacific commitment to continuing advocating for climate action, and of course the acknowledgement of the support from our various partners. Thank you very much. I would like to now invite the Honorable Minister of the Ministry of Natural Resources and Environment and the Samoa Tourism Authority, Honorable Toisulu Cedric Schuster, for your keynote address. Thank you, sir. You have the floor.
Thank you, Ofa. Reverend Yese Willie, Leota Kosilatu, Director General of SPREP, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, talofa to everyone. At the outset, I would like to thank the organizers for convening this important Pacific webinar on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, Working Group 2, 6 Assessment Report, specifically on an overview on impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability for the Pacific. Climate change is a complex, multidisciplinary issue that affects all sectors of society and the development agenda more broadly. On the 28th of February 2002, the Ipcc, as the world's most authoritative source of climate science and approved by 195 countries, published the Working Group 2 contribution to the 6th Assessment Report. This assesses the impacts of climate change, looking at ecosystems, biodiversity, and human communities at the global and regional level. It also reviews vulnerabilities and capacities and limits of the natural world and human societies to adapt to climate change. The IPCC's objective since 1988 has been to provide governments at all levels with scientific information that they can use to develop climate policies. The AR6 is a continuation of this work and will provide current climate change information across 4 reports: a physical science basis, impacts and adaptation and vulnerability, mitigation and climate change, and the synthesis report. The report confirms that we are not on track to meet the Paris Climate Agreement. And based on all scenarios, we'll see a 1.50 degrees increase in global temperatures from 2021 to 2040. and will exceed this increase by 2041 onwards, reaching up to 3 degrees in temperature increase by 2060 and up to 5.7 degrees at the end of the century, using the highest emissions scenario. For the Pacific, global heating above 1.5 degrees will be catastrophic, as sea levels will very likely continue to rise with higher emissions. Sea level rise coupled with storm surges and waves will exacerbate coastal inundation and the potential for increased saltwater intrusion into aquifers. Sea level rise will cause shorelines to retreat further along our sandy coasts. We will face more intense but generally fewer tropical cyclones. Marine heat waves and ocean acidification will increase and worsen with larger increases at 2 degrees. Higher evapotranspiration will either amplify or partially offset the effect of decreases or increases in rainfall, resulting in increased aridity in parts of the Pacific, and will lead to the loss of entire countries due to sea level rise within the century. We in the Pacific Islands are viewed as the canary in the coal mine for climate change. Having already suffered from king tides, disastrous storms, saltwater intrusion, droughts, and gradual loss of our low-lying areas to sea level rise for many years. The Ipcc AR6 paints a bleak picture, sending an unequivocal message that human activities cause climate change and that the consequences of anthropogenic climate change is already upon us and is projected to continue and increase in severity and frequency. The science is clear and the solution is very simple. Reduce GHG emissions to stop climate change. Though the situation seems clear on the surface, the path to decarbonizing is complex and involves drastic behavioral changes, global cooperation, and political will. Many Pacific Island countries and territories, including Samoa, know this only too well. And while we have some success stories and best practices of adaptation throughout our region, our vulnerability continue to evolve because of factors out of our control, including the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. While we are setting policies at the global level, climate actions at the regional and national level are also crucial in addressing the impacts of climate change. At the Forum Leaders Summit, Samoa and the Pacific is committed to a strong regional action, harnessing shared stewardship of the Pacific Ocean and acting as one Blue Pacific continent. Samoa continues to reaffirm, together with other Pacific Island countries, that climate change represents the single greatest threat to the livelihoods, security, and well-being of our people. Samoa shares with other SIDS the characteristics of being economically vulnerable and ecologically fragile because of its geographic location, isolation, and limited resources. The pathway for the development of Samoa 2021-22 to 2025-26 theme of empowering communities, building resilience, and inspiring growth reflects the strong recognition on the climate crisis we now face. Samoa's latest State of the Environment Report 2013 states that the impacts of human-induced climate change and climate variability predicted in the 2006 SOE reports are now a reality. Observed trends include increased maximum air temperatures, increased frequency in extreme daily rainfall events, and sea level rise of 5.2 millimeters a year, as well as the increase in frequency and intensity of cyclones. Samoa's climate change policy of 2020 to 2030 and implementation is aligned to all relevant agreements and plans in place at the international and regional level. The vision of the climate change policy is to secure a resilient, safe, and prosperous Samoa, addressing climate change and associated impacts while achieving sustainable development. It provides the foundation of actions for coherent coordination on climate change adaptation and mitigation activities between different institutions and levels of government, and supports Samoa to meet its international obligation. COP26 was a pivotal moment for the world and SIDS. We must swiftly implement important gains from COP26, including the mitigation work program, the global goal on adaptation, and amongst others. We need to work hard to provide concrete outcome on the agreed elements, as well as securing loss and damage financing. The Ipcc Working Group 2 report underscore what's at stake. As a region known to be vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, we should continue at the national and regional level to be proactive to implement mitigation and adaptation work, building capacity both technically and with our resources, whilst revving up our voices for the scaling up of climate financing. We must continue to be seen and heard at the international arena, pushing for our priorities as a Blue Pacific for human behavioral changes, global cooperation, and political will to decarbonizing the world. In closing, I wish to sincerely thank the organizers for convening this webinar. It is important to foster networks and continuing our partnership with SPRIP, the PCCC, and other centers of excellence to disseminate research and scientific assessments to assist countries implement practical solutions and actions to combat climate change and build resilience for Pacific people and communities. Manutele Inal Fontanga, Soifua, Mayamanuia, God bless.
Whawhetai tere lava, Honorable Minister for Environment and Tourism Authority. Thank you for reinforcing the objectives of the report to assist government to design transformational policy, and also reinforcing the solutions we need to take to address the risks posed by climate change. And I also like to acknowledge your reaffirmation of Samoa's commitment to the climate change action through its national pathway, climate change policy, and the reports. Thank you very much, Honorable Minister. Ladies and gentlemen, online and here at the Pacific Climate Change Center, we have concluded the formalities, and I would like to move on to taking a group photo before we go into the next session, which is the panel, the presentation from Professor Mark Howden. So we will have 5 minutes to take a group photo, and then we will move on to the next session. Thank you. Can I invite that you turn on your camera, and also invite those who are here at the center to please make your way this side so we can have take a group photo, please. Thank you. Thank you. We will start in a minute with the presentation. Can I invite the panelists to please give it. Thank you, participants, for your patience. We'll now move to the session 2, which is the presentation from Professor Mark Howden. May I kindly just give a brief background to Professor Howden. He is a vice chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and also the director of the Institute for Climate, Energy and Disaster Solutions at the Australian National University. Mark has been a major contributor of the Ipcc since 1991, with roles in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, and now the 6th assessment report, and also sharing the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize. He also helped develop both the national and international greenhouse gas inventories that are fundamental to the Paris Agreement and has assessed sustainable ways to reduce emissions. Mark has worked on climate variability, climate change, innovation, and adaptation issues for over 30 years. Good to have you on board, Mark, and I also would like to acknowledge the support from the Australian National University. You have the floor, Professor Mark. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Offa, and thanks for SPREP and the Pacific Climate Centre for hosting us or co-hosting this event with us, and it's very much appreciated. So before I start, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on who I stand, that's the Ngunnawal people, and pay my respects to elders past and present. I'd also like to acknowledge Mahilani Delaney, who's the co-author of this presentation with me, and also her contribution to developing the fact sheets. So we've got a series of fact sheets available at that address down the bottom of the presentation. And those are prepared for the Pacific Islands on 6 different topics, but taking the information from the Ipcc and presenting it in an easily understood and digestible way. So I encourage you to download those fact sheets. So I will just start to share my slides here, and hopefully that will be showing up now. Offer?
Yes, confirming we can.
Perfect, excellent. And so just noticing that the URL down the bottom if you want to download those fact sheets. So what we're dealing with here is an absolutely massive report, which has been many years in the preparation, and it's had many people across the Pacific involved in it, and particularly Morgan Wairu, who was a coordinating lead author on the Small Islands chapter. And so I'd particularly like to acknowledge Morgan's involvement in the development of this report. But this report is only one of many, and the Minister and also the Director General mentioned this. We've got multiple IPCC reports in this 6th assessment cycle. So the first of those reports was what we call the 1.5 degrees report, which laid out the case for keeping temperatures down to 1.5 degrees and the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees in terms of impacts. And the key quote that came out of that was, this report shows that we need urgent and unprecedented change across all aspects of our society if we're to keep temperatures within manageable limits. Subsequent to that, we had the land report, then the oceans report. Last year, we had the IPCC climate science report, and that was called a Code Red for Humanity. And then this report, which was released last week. And the Antonio Guterres from the UN described this as an atlas of human suffering and a demonstration of the abject failure of leadership in relation to climate change. So, and those are very strong words, but I think they're appropriate as my presentation will show. Now in a few weeks' time, we've also got the IPCC report on mitigation, emission reduction, and we're also looking to have a similar event with the PCC in relation to the release of that report. And then later this year, we've got the synthesis report, which brings all of these different reports together in preparation for the UN Global Stocktake, which essentially assesses how well are we doing on climate change. Now, if we look at this report, it's a massive report. It's over 3,600 pages. It was prepared by 270 authors and over 600 contributing authors. Those authors were drawn from 67 countries, with around about 40% of those from authors from developing countries and the remainder from developed countries. And the Pacific, I would hesitate to say, but I think this is accurate, is underrepresented in terms of its contributions to this report. So there's room to move in terms of increasing the involvement of Pacific countries in these IPCC reports. You had just over 40% of women contributing to this, and that author group as a whole cited 34,000 papers, different scientific reports in the production of this IPCC report. And in the process, they dealt with more than 62,000 comments from reviewers, from governments and from other scientists and non-government organisations, each of which has to be dealt with explicitly. And because this report builds on previous IPCC reports, such as the 5th assessment report, I think it's fair to say that this provides the best understanding to date of climate impacts, adaptation and vulnerability. And in part, that's because we've got increased data since the 5th assessment report. So we've continued all of those scientific studies and written them up, and so there's more information to be drawn together. But also in part because those years since the last report, those 8 years, at least 7 of those 8 years were the hottest years on record. And possibly, depending on which climate record you look at, it could be 8 out of those 8 years were the hottest years on record. So we've got a lot of lived experience to draw in to this report as well. And I think that's a really important message, which was repeated by the previous speakers, is that we are already seeing impacts on climate change. And importantly, when we look at what sort of the evidence base and the confidence in detecting climate change and attributing impacts to climate change, we've made significant steps. And that's what this graph, which comes from the Small Island chapter of the Working Group 2 report, shows. And essentially down the bottom, it talks about confidence in the detection. So how easily can we detect climate change impacts? And then confidence in the attribution on the vertical axis. So that is, how confident are we that the impacts we are seeing are due to climate change? And we can see, for example, in the top right-hand corner, that's the high and high element of this graph. You can see that we're very confident we're detecting climate change impacts and they're attributable to climate change, human-induced climate change, in terms of coral reef bleaching, in terms of submergence and flooding, and species range shifts and behaviours. So we've had a significant improvement in terms of our scientific understanding. But through this presentation, I want to just put up a proposition to you. So this is actually a quote here from the well-known psychologist Daniel Kahneman, who's written about climate change and how it impacts on human minds and how our human minds interpret climate change. And his proposition is that the human mind is not equipped to deal with climate change because we see it as distant, both in terms of space and in terms of time. It's abstract and it's also contested. People argue over it. And I think the combination of the Working Group 1 report and this report essentially blows those arguments out of the water. I would argue that it's no longer geographically distant, because what this report shows is climate change impacts are hitting every continent, every island, every ocean, every sector of human activity right now. And so it's no longer spatially distant because it's happening on our doorstep, and it's also time-wise, it's a near and present danger. And it's no longer abstract because these impacts are real, they're significant, and they're meaningful for us as humans and our societies. And I would argue it's no longer contested. The Working Group 1 report said climate change impacts or climate changes are unequivocal. Those influences of human impact on climate are unequivocal. And this report says exactly the same thing. Climate change impacts across the globe are now no longer in doubt. They are due to human influence. So what I'm going to cover in this presentation is basically two components. One is looking at impacts, which are happening now and also in the future. And the second, which is looking at the solutions, the hope, the action that we can take to deal with climate change. Now, firstly, just a very quick coverage of some of the underlying climate stresses. And really important to note that the Pacific is already being impacted by both slow onset stresses and extreme events, the acute things, which, for example, are happening right now on the east coast of Australia. So the slow onset stresses on the left-hand side include increase in air temperature and ocean temperature, changes in rainfall patterns, sea level rise, which has already been mentioned, and also ocean acidification. As the ocean absorbs carbon dioxide, it becomes slightly less alkaline, and that impacts on all sorts of processes, including coral reefs. And in terms of extreme events, as a proportion of the cyclones we're experiencing across the globe, there's more category 3, 4, and 5 cyclones, the really bad ones. And within each category, the average wind speed is increasing. And the wind speed is the real cause of much of the damage in cyclones. We're seeing associated with those increased cyclone strength and sea level rise, we're seeing increased storm surges. So that's where a cyclone or a storm pushes water up against the islands in the Pacific and causes extra flooding. At the same time, we're seeing more droughts and more extreme rainfall, the sort of thing that happened in Australia. So in parts of Australia, we had almost the whole yearly average rainfall in just 2 or 3 days. Incredibly intense. We're seeing increased climate variability. So in our part of the world, El Nino is a big driver of the variability, the dry years, wet years, etc. And that's increasing. So the wet years tend to be getting wetter and the dry years tend to be getting drier. And of course, more frequent and severe heat waves. And that can impact in all sorts of ways. Impacts on our economy, impacts on our physical health, and impacts on our mental health. And when we look at the accumulation of evidence that these impacts are already happening across the world, we see this a map like this. So this is drawn from something over 78,000 different sets of data. And what this shows is when you divide the world up into small squares, you can actually see the number of studies per grid square. And many parts of the world are understudied, and that includes our oceans. So there's not as many studies on our oceans as there are on our land. But even parts of the land area, such as the Sahara Desert or Siberia, are much less studied than other places. But when you look at this map, it is really clear right overall that we're already seeing major impacts of climate change on every system that we're dealing with. Now, when we look at this, in a sense, break it down and look at the impacts of climate change on different systems in different places, we've produced this figure, and I don't expect you to interpret all of this figure, but basically down the left-hand side are different geographical zones. So for starters, there's a global assessment, then there's Africa as a continent, Australasia, Australia and New Zealand, and then further down there's the small islands across the globe. So that's 2/3 the way down that list. And against each of these regions, we have the climate change impacts on water and food, on health and well-being, on cities, settlements and infrastructure. And for each of these cells in this table, there's an assessment of whether these impacts are negative, neutral or positive. And if you look at this as a whole, what we see is climate change is already impacting on human systems and the impact is overall net negative right across the globe. Almost every one of those cells has a minus in it. And in those few cells where there's a plus, in other words, positive impacts, it's also accompanied by a minus. In other words, in some places, for some activities, there might be benefits, but there's also problems associated with it as well. So that message of overall climate change being negative on human systems is, I think, a really important one. Now, when we actually start to break that down a bit, I'm just trying to get my system to move. We look at different risks. I'm sorry, I just have lost my presentation. I'll restart that again. Just a minor computer glitch here. Sorry about this. Come on. Sorry about this. Just the best laid plans of people can come adrift at different times. So just trying to get that back. So the next thing I was going to say is, just while I'm messing around with the computer, is that the next slide shows that we're already seeing and concerned about projections in terms of really critical systems like food security, here we go. Water resources, like floods and health issues right across the globe. And so the sort of accumulation of evidence for things that really concern us is really strong. And so there's every right to, as one of the previous speakers said, was to be really concerned about climate change. It's a real significant problem for us. So I'll just keep that off again, and hopefully that's showing up as a full screen again. Offer?
Yes, confirming that.
Okay, so just reiterating, heat stress likely to increase, water scarcity in many places, including Pacific Islands where sea level rise goes up and salinity of water lenses is going to be a problem. Food security is a big one for the Pacific Islands, and of course flood risk associated with sea level rise, and also those storms that I mentioned before. So what we're seeing is accumulation of risks, and of course in the Pacific Islands we see significant potential inundation or flood events affecting many islands and the large portion of populations of these islands. So what this particular map shows is how the proportion of populations of different island groups or island nations across the Pacific are likely to be affected by sea level rise and flooding. And we can see that in some islands groups, that's the majority of the population. So no news there, but just reinforcement of existing concerns. In these reports, the Ipcc reports, ever since the third assessment report, we've produced what we call the burning embers diagrams, which are risk assessments. And what these do is they show the link between climate change risks for different concerns based on different emission scenarios. So we see on the left-hand side of this panel are different greenhouse gas emission scenarios. There's the lower ones are the very low and low emission scenarios that attempt to keep temperatures below 2 degrees, and if possible down to 1.5. And then we've got the higher emission scenarios which result in increased temperatures over time. And that, when we actually look at those temperatures, we can actually track from those temperatures associated with these scenarios across to these burning embers, the risk diagrams. And if we just, for example, look at the first of those bars where it says unique and threatened systems, if we think about that as biodiversity and ecosystems, what we can see is that these colours, which indicate If it's white, it's no risk. If it's a sort of yellowy color, it's a moderate risk. Red is high risk, and the sort of purpley red is very high risk. In other words, unmanageable and irreversible risk. And we can see, for example, for our ecosystems as a whole, once we're at 1.1 degrees, which is where we are now in terms of global temperature rise, we're into that high risk zone. And as we head towards 2 degrees, we go into that irreversible and unmanageable risk zone. And if we look at, say, extreme weather events, the risk profile is very similar. Once we get a bit above 1.1 degrees, we start to get into that high risk zone. And then by 2 degrees, we're heading into that irreversible and unmanageable zone. And if we look at these burning embers, unfortunately, they weren't produced for the small islands. And so I don't have a series of those for small islands. But if, for example, we look at warm water corals, which are very relevant in the Pacific, that's the left-hand bar, we can see that already at 1.1 degrees, we're already in the high risk zone. And if we go to 1.5 degrees, we're starting to go into the unmanageable and irreversible. And once we go to 2 degrees, we're right into that irreversible and unmanageable risk. So really significant concerns. And when we translate that to other issues for the Pacific Islands, we'd see similar, maybe not quite so problematic risk profiles. This report also, for the first time, raised the concepts of complex and cascading risks, at least the first time for Ipcc. So a complex risk is where multiple things interact, where you have perhaps coastal development interacting with increased cyclone damage, interacting with sea level rise. And then there's cascading risks. And so a cascading risk is where one risk triggers another, which triggers another. And so, for example, we may have cyclone damage, which triggers economic loss, which means that you have people who can't build buildings which protect themselves against climate change, which then gives them physical and mental health concerns. And so you get this cascade of risks. And so it's important not to think just of individual risks, but these complex risks and cascading risks. Now, if you think about the coral reefs, which I just highlighted before, there's just a few pictures to illustrate this. And again, I'm sure you're quite aware of this, but if you look at the left-hand side, we see a healthy reef, one of those reefs which may have occurred in past decades. We see a reef in the middle, which has had some damage from climate change, such as high temperature bleaching, loss of species composition, lower complexity, lower fish diversity, lower productivity. And then on the right-hand side, we've got a degraded coral reef where it's just had back-to-back coral bleaching events with very few species, very small growth, very low productivity. And importantly, when we're looking at coral reefs, we see that climate change is interacting with other factors, such as pollution, like nitrate pollution from the sugarcane country that happens in Australia, sedimentation from development in the catchments next to the reef, coastal development, which may disrupt the reef, and damage from problematic fishing practices, such as using explosives on reef. And if we look at the impact of climate change on marine productivity across the Pacific, we see even under a low emission scenario, which is the left-hand panel, we can see significant areas have large-scale reductions in productivity of the range from 10 to 30%. But however, there are a few places, including, say, east of Fiji, which actually are projected to have increases in animal biomass and productivity. And a lot of that seems to be associated with movement of species associated with changes in ocean currents and ocean temperatures. If we look at the right-hand panel, which is a high emission scenario, hopefully we never get anywhere close to this. But if we do go there, essentially right across the Pacific, again with that small area to the east of Fiji, it's projected to be significant lower animal biomass and marine productivity. And of course, that impacts on things like health, food security, nutrition security, and export earnings, because in many island nations, the fisheries associated with those nations are significant export dollar earners. So what I've just painted out there is a picture of significant projected damage and losses. And clearly we need urgent action to adapt to climate change. But at the same time, it's not just focusing on adaptation. We also have to focus on reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. And we need to make sure that those happen together rather than separately. So if we look at adaptation, one of the key figures coming out of this in the summary for policymakers was what we call a feasibility assessment. So rather than expect you to read the whole thing, I'll just zoom in on part of it, the top part of this feasibility assessment. And this deals with essentially the oceans and terrestrial ecosystems. So what we have is different key risks in this table, such as impacts, risks to water security or food security. And then we have a series of possible adaptation responses, such as forestry adaptation, water use adaptation, cropland management to adapt to the climate change. And for each of these adaptations, we assess the potential feasibility of those adaptations. With the bigger the dot, the more feasible it is. And that feasibility is assessed on these 6 different criteria or dimensions, such as economic feasibility, technological, institutional, social, and other feasibility factors. And we also assess for each of these adaptation options whether there was synergies or otherwise with emission reduction, with mitigation. So in the case, for example, of forest-based adaptation, we see that there's a very strong synergy with emission reduction. So the more we can adapt our forests to a changing climate, the more likely they are to absorb carbon and hold on to that carbon, and in the process, lowering the atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations. So these sorts of tables are ways of assessing and bringing together massive amounts of data in a way that is relatively easy to understand in terms of its prospects for adaptation. Now, one of the key things, of course, is adapting to sea level rise. So what these figures show is essentially different adaptation options available to manage sea level rise. So, for example, if we have sea level rising and possibly increased wave energy because we have stronger winds across our ocean, so we're already seeing increased wave energy due to climate change, that will, if we have our, say, infrastructure and housing very close to the ocean, significantly increase the risks of damage. So one way of managing that is looking at what we call ecosystem-based measures. So, for example, planting trees in front of those houses so it absorbs some of the wave energy so we don't get our houses as damaged as much. Another option in some circumstances is using hard protection, such as seawalls. And in those circumstances where those seawalls work well, and in many cases they don't, but where they work well, that can protect the infrastructure, the houses and roads and buildings behind the seawall. But of course, if you get a high water event or a cyclone which overtops the seawall, so the water comes over the seawall, then often you've got a very substantial amount of high value infrastructure which is not designed to deal with floods and water. And so you can actually result in very significant flood damage in those circumstances. So your seawall has to be big enough to handle any reasonable event. Secondly, is that we can do what we call accommodation. So we can sort of stay in the same place but change our infrastructure. So, for example, you can put houses on stilts, so you raise the level of the floor so it doesn't get impacted by the floods to the same extent. Or you can do planned relocation, so you can move some of your houses up the hill, and in parts of the Pacific, there's already agreements for some communities to do this progressively over time or sometimes all at once. And that then can relocate those houses in a place where they're out of harm's way. Now, all of these sort of adaptations can happen over different timescales, and each of those will be different. So how you do it with one village may be different from another. How you do it with one island group or one island type, such as a low-lying island versus a more mountainous island nation, will be different. So there's a contextual element in all of these changes. But one of the things that we report on in this IPCC assessment is that there are limits to adaptation and there are prospects for maladaptation. So one of the key messages coming out of the summary is that there is a narrowing window for climate action. The more temperatures rise and climate change occurs, the less effective our adaptation options become, and the smaller the range of sensible adaptation options become. So in a sense, our menu of adaptations diminishes the more climate change we have, which is a very unfortunate thing. And so, for example, where you have increases over 1.5 degrees, people living on small islands or in places where there's glacial or snowmelt, which provides their fresh water, they may no longer be able to adapt. So there's hard limits to adaptation for some people. And of course, in the Pacific Islands, you're very aware of this. By 2 degrees, farming in many existing farm areas may become increasingly challenged. And so increased food security issues in many parts of the world. And even if we adapt well, what this assessment says is that we can't prevent all losses and damages. So there's a residual risk, even if we do the best practice adaptation in many cases. And when we look at the financial flows for climate action and climate response, so these are finances that have been promised at the Paris meeting and also at Glasgow, etc. The assessment is that those financial flows which are already on the table are insufficient. And importantly, of the money that's already being distributed, only about 4 to 8% of that, a really small proportion, actually ends up being used for climate adaptation. The vast majority of it is used for emission reduction. And yet adaptation is a near-term issue and a near-term need for many countries across the Pacific. And of course, we need to be very aware of the possibility of maladaptive responses. So for example, doing something that locks us into future vulnerabilities, or doing something which increases greenhouse gas emissions, which makes the problem worse, and so makes our adaptations less effective. What we see across this report is that there's increasing gaps between the adaptation action which has been taken and what is rationally needed for the current and future climate changes. And unfortunately, these gaps in adaptation are the largest amongst lower income populations, so the poor and disadvantaged people, and those gaps are expected to grow. So clearly that's an argument for accelerating climate adaptation, so making it happen a lot faster. And some of the things that can accelerate climate adaptation, which are identified in this report, is strong political commitment and follow through across all levels of government, and integration of action across all levels of government. We need good, strong, clear institutional frameworks which have clear goals and priorities that define responsibilities by different actors. We need to continue to enhance our knowledge of risks and of adaptation options, because doing that can improve adaptation responses and increase the co-benefits from adaptation. Because this is likely to go on for decades and decades, and we're not going to get everything right the first time, we need to monitor and evaluate adaptation measures as they're implemented, not just to track progress, but so we can accelerate our learning so we can do adaptation better and better over time. And inclusive governance is identified as something that is really important. And in particular, this inclusive governance needs to prioritize equity, climate justice, and inclusion. And that inclusion of different voices in adaptation responses is a key theme throughout this assessment report. So participatory inclusion of different social groups is really critical for positive adaptation outcomes. And this is one example, the relocation project in Fiji, where all of the people in that village and more broadly have been included in that process. And the last thing I'd emphasize is that when we're dealing with adaptation, we assessed these against achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. So the Sustainable Development Goals identified over on the right-hand side of this panel, the different colours in, the symbolic sort of colours for the sustainable development. And on the left-hand side, we have each of those adaptation options that I showed up before in the feasibility assessment. So each of those adaptation options is assessed against the sort of co-benefits with ecosystem services, the way in which it can contribute to resolving issues of gender equity or income disparity and income inequities. And so each of these cells across this is given either a plus or a minus. And we can see that, for example, most of the cells give very strong positive feedbacks to ecosystem services. Some of the cells give positive co-benefits in terms of improving gender equity. But if we look at the right-hand side with the Sustainable Development Goals, there's an assessed synergy between these adaptation actions, if they're done well, and sustainable development in almost every cell on that table. So the message here is that adaptation is really core to meeting sustainable development, just like sustainable development is core to meeting adaptation. And the last point that I'd make is that in this report, we talk about climate resilient development. So that's where we have adaptation plus emission reduction plus sustainable development. And when we look across the globe, that combination is already being challenged by our current global warming levels of 1.1 degrees. And as the temperature goes up to 1.5 or possibly 2 degrees, that's going to become ever more difficult to achieve. And just to wrap up, the really quick summary, which Rebecca Colvin and I developed after the 1.5 degrees report, is on this slide. It says, every half a degree matters. Every year matters. There's urgency. And every choice that we make matters. And again, just drawing your attention to the URL here on this slide, which has the fact sheets which we've prepared with PCC for the Pacific, so you can read those at your leisure. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Fafatai Lava, thank you, Professor Mark Howden, for that very informative presentation, covering a wide range of topics that includes the overall structure of the Ipcc assessment cycle, but also taking a deep dive into the report overview of impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability in the different sectors. And of course, importantly, the adaptation options for the Pacific and opportunities for the Pacific to engage more in the Ipcc process and report. Thank you very much, and we appreciate your time. Colleagues, I can see that there's already a few questions on the Q&A box. We will now, we will now transition to the panel discussion, and at the end of the panel discussion, we will try and address the questions. Can I now move on to session 2, which is the panel discussion? I would like to, as your moderator, I would like to introduce the distinguished panel for this afternoon. First up, I have Dr. Luteru Tawale, the Assistant CEO for Meteorology Division at the Ministry of Natural Resources and Environment. And Dr. Luteru has worked in the meteorology field for about 15 years, for over 15 years. And he is also an author of the Ipcc Working Group 1. So that's really great to see the involvement of Dr. Luteru in the Working Group 1 Ipcc report. I graduated with a Doctor of Science in Meteorology from the Nagoya University in Japan. And he is now the ACO for the Ministry of Environment in the Meteorology Division. I would also like to introduce Ms. Philomena Nelson. She is the Climate Change Adaptation Advisor here at SPREP, and she has more than 20 years of work experience in various roles, leading and coordinating the development of mechanisms to strengthen disaster adaptation and climate resilience in the Pacific. And much of the work that Ms. Nelson has involved in includes governing and policy reviews, enhancing operational arrangements for the effective and efficient coordination of disaster risk management in the Pacific. Thank you. The next panel, the next panelist is Ms. Yvette Kerslake. She is the Technical Advisor, Science to Services at the Pacific Climate Change Center. And she has more than 10 years of work experience in environment and climate change. And also she was Assistant Resident Representative and Program Manager, Environment and Energy, Climate Change Division at UNDP before she joined the Pacific Climate Change Center. And last panelist, he is joining us all the way from Papua New Guinea, Talofalava Chona Auka, and Chona is the manager for projects under the Adaptation and Projects Division under the Climate Change and Development Authority of Papua New Guinea. He is also the PCITS coordinator on adaptation, and he will continue in this role leading up to COP27. Talofa lava, and good to have you, John. The panel objectives for today is to try and address the knowledge gap in the Pacific region around the work of the Ipcc, and of course, engaging key decision makers, including policymakers, experts, and the public. And the other objective of the panel discussion is to provide the most up-to-date synthesis of relevant climate change information to diverse Pacific Island audiences, and particularly to agencies responsible for climate program implementation and to policymakers. Thank you, distinguished panelists, for agreeing to be part of today's panel. First question is to Dr. Luteru Tawale. Dr. Luteru, as a lead climate change science institution and being focal point for Ipcc, and of course an author of Working Group 1, what are some of the challenges you face as a Pacific scientist, and what is your recommendation for other countries in order for us to be more involved in the Ipcc process and report? Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, and Talofa lava. Good afternoon to everyone who's joining this very important webinar. As question said, well, my involvement was particularly in terms of tropical cyclones research, and the main challenge that I experienced was the lack of quality data to conduct research, and very limited amount of peer review publications. Not having the right resources to conduct research here in our Pacific Islands, particularly in terms of technology, not to mention the availability of things such as supercomputers and all those kind of technology. Also note that the accuracy of tropical cyclone related data, which is available in Pacific now, 40 years back, is quite, the accuracy is quite low in comparison to other regions in the world, the Asian region, the Atlantic, and the American and European. This is partly due to the availability of observations in the past in terms of satellite observation and the airborne aeroplanes observation. This has a major impact on trying to identify the actual trend of tropical cyclones related parameters in the past. So I saw there is a significant gap in terms of scientific understanding of the evolution, not only of tropical cyclones, but the other natural hazards such as rainfall, temperatures, and all those kind of meteorological and climate change parameters. So in terms of recommendation, as I mentioned, the limited amount of research in the Pacific Island countries and territories urgently need to increase the scientific capacity in terms of reporting and conducting research, and as well as transferring these data and knowledge to decision makers and of course policy makers. The need to strengthen the partnerships with relevant institutions and to peer and share capacity and make the most of what's available. The limited resources that is available, we need to make the most of what's available to our Pacific region. There's also a need to upgrade to the new technology, the state-of-the-art technology, and to be innovative in the way how we observe and predict the future changes in this changing climate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Luteru. And I think we all agree with you on the challenges, but as well as the solutions. Moving on, I would like to cross over to Papua New Guinea to Mr. Chona Auka. Chona, the IPCC reports inform policymakers and what scientists know about climate change. What would this entail for the Pacific region for the upcoming COP27, in particular negotiations on the global goal on adaptation, climate finance, as well as reporting technology and capacity support? The report highlighted the urgency of stepping up adaptation action, and what does this mean for Papua New Guinea? Thank you.
All right, good afternoon from PNG. Thank you very much, Ofa, for giving me the opportunity this afternoon to share with you some key messages on the current negotiations around adaptation at the UNFCCC. I think coming back to the questions that have been provided, last year in Glasgow, COP26, we saw that, with the discussions around adaptation, one of the key areas was around trying to finalize or look at ways, especially, for us in the Pacific, trying to negotiate the global goal on adaptation. And within the negotiations, as the PC's coordinator on adaptation, one of the key messages that we got out of the negotiations, and then after COP26 was the launch of the 2-year Glasgow Sharm el-Sheikh work program, which is going to be ongoing for the next 2 years. And it's a significant step forward in establishing the GGA outlined in the Paris Agreement, and the discussions in Glasgow and the subsequent decisions reinforce that adaptation actions are inherently national and should be local as well. And for developing countries like PC's Pacific Small Island developing states, it is crucial that the global goal on adaptation reflects the realities on the ground and will be nationally determined and locally, should be locally appropriate. In addition to that as well, we need to see that the global goal on adaptation should not become a top-down reporting exercise that further burdens countries with limited resources, but instead it should become a tool that helps countries to identify their strengths and weaknesses so that they can better respond to the impacts on climate change. And, there is much work still to be done to bring the global goal on adaptation concept to life, but striking a balance between global goal adaptation serving its global purpose whilst providing sufficient flexibility for countries to describe their own adaptation objectives and progress will certainly in time determine the effectiveness of the GGA. So those were some of the key messages or key points that I wanted to reiterate this afternoon. And also coming back to your question on how can this GGA affect the sort of the other aspects of the negotiations in terms of finance, technology. I guess once we have a very set global goal on adaptation, which really outlines the priorities and the vulnerabilities that most of our small island developing states are been affected by, then the financing and the discussions around technology will follow suit once we have that finalized. So it's like I said, for us within the UNFCCC space, within the negotiations, that 2-year work program is welcome for us, but there still needs some more work to be done, and we look forward to having some form of institutional arrangements, a clear scope, objectives, and modalities on how we can frame the global goal on adaptation. Coming back to the PNG context, for us, with the Ipcc report that has been the 6th Ipcc report on the working group 2 on impacts, adaptation, and vulnerabilities, I think for Papua New Guinea right now, we're currently at the stage of developing our national adaptation plan, and it's timely for us. The report has come out in a very timely manner, where we now going to look at how we can incorporate that into our national adaptation plan in alignment with our national determined contributions, and see how we can address climate change, especially within our key development sectors like transport, infrastructure, agriculture, and health. So those are the 4 key development sectors that we would like to see climate change adaptation being mainstream, because that is where we see that most of the development that is taking place within the country. So the National Adaptation Plan would like to see that this Ipcc report is also being incorporated into the national circumstances or the section of the document. So we see that we can put some evidence-based enabling frameworks in the document, so that it gives teeth for us to really implement climate change adaptation action at the national level. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jonah, for those remarks, and we agree with you on there needs to be a scope on how we can frame the global goal on adaptation to be more relevant and locally appropriated, and also acknowledging the work that has been done by Papua New Guinea in this initiative, in this area, and also your remarks on mainstreaming of the Ipcc information and latest information into the national climate change policies and plans. Thank you for those remarks, Jonah. I would like to now move on to Ms. Philomena Nelson. Philomena, this report assesses the impacts of climate change from a worldwide to a regional view on ecosystems and biodiversity, and of humans and their diverse societies, cultures, and settlements. It considers their vulnerability and thereby reduce climate-associated risks, together with options for creating a sustainable future for all through an equitable and integrated approach to mitigation and adaptation efforts at all scales. As the Climate Adaptation Advisor for SPREP, could you elaborate on the work of SPREP in the context of adaptation? Thank you.
Thank you, moderator. The focus of the work of SPREP in climate change is on the application of science coupled with traditional knowledge across sectors, as well as the implementation of adaptation and mitigation solutions, as well as supporting the Pacific countries in enhancing their climate change policies and nationally determined contributions, as well as strengthening national capacities and positions on issues pertinent to the Pacific during the UNFCCC negotiations. Access to climate finance remains a big challenge in the region. Funding is not being accessed fast enough due to bureaucratic and complex review processes, and the lack of financial resources to assist direct access entities at the national level as well as at the regional level to enable them to provide that support that is needed by our countries to access climate finance. SPREP as an accredited entity is supporting some of the Pacific SIDS through the GCF readiness and support program to help them strengthen institutional and governance arrangements as well as systems and processes in order for them to access climate finance either directly or indirectly with the support of regional and international accredited entities to the GCF and the Adaptation Fund. It is also supporting the Pacific SIDS to access the National Adaptation Planning Fund through the GCF to strengthen their adaptation planning process and develop their national adaptation plans and facilitate the support for the implementation of priority adaptation actions. Through the National Adaptation Planning Project, SPREP will be working in collaboration with the PSIDS that we are supporting at this stage in updating climate projections and impact scenarios, building on the findings of the Ipcc special reports and the work that our regional organization and some of our partners have been developing in the last 20 or so years, as well as updating climate change vulnerability and risk assessment, which is an ongoing process, which will then inform practical and sustainable application actions at community, sectoral, and at national levels, as well as enhancing skill sets and knowledge to enable countries and their communities to undertake future adaptation planning and implement their adaptation actions. Part of that program is also to develop project concepts to ensure that the key adaptation priorities of these countries that are identified in their NAPs are implemented in the near future. We have also just completed the development of the Pacific National Adaptation Guideline, which we hope the Pacific Islands can use to meet their specific adaptation needs and to help guide their planning processes that contribute to building long-term resilience and assist them in achieving their transformative adaptation outcomes. This is part of our efforts to contextualize what has been agreed at the global level, given that each Pacific Island is different and unique in terms of their topography, their environment, their culture, their language, and the way of life. The report shows for the first time that irreversible loss and damage is already a grim reality for the vulnerable countries such as our Pacific Islands. Although the Pacific Islands have contributed the least to the climate catastrophe, we are the front line of the catastrophe. And with the continued increase in emissions, the Pacific is on the pathway of losing islands, sovereignty, culture, identity, and our homes that we call the paradise in the future. Therefore, the issue of loss and damage And I can see a lot of questions around that to you, Professor Howden, on loss and damage, is at the heart of the Pacific asks at the UNFCCC or during the Conference of the Parties. In fact, the issue of loss and damage was first raised by Vanuatu before the UNFCCC came to life. There are places in the Pacific that have never experienced inundation before, but now they have. There are also areas in the region where coastal and river revetment have been built with the hope that this will prevent inundation, but are no longer able to withstand the increasing inundation levels that we have observed to date. In 2020, SPREP commissioned a study and developed a framework to inform potential development of a climate change insurance facility and also financing options or mechanisms. The aim of this initiative was to have this support the work in addressing the issue of loss and damage. Building on this initiative, we are planning to hold consultative workshops before the UNFCCC subsidiary body session in June for the Pacific SIDS to really unpack and undertake in-depth analysis of loss and damage, what it means to the Pacific. How do we address the issue of compensation? What is a loss and damage facility might look like? And what evidence base that is needed to support national action to address loss and damage? What methodologies should we use to assess climate change-induced loss and damage? And how this will feed into the PSID's positions on this very issue. And also looking into capacity building to ensure our Pacific people are fully informed about this issue. And to conclude, moderator, the report itself emphasizes that time is of the essence. The window to secure a livable and sustainable future for all is rapidly closing. We need to scale up and speed up adaptation actions that are transformative, inclusive, that take into consideration the specific needs and challenges of the Pacific people. There is no time to continue in the current pathway of using fragmented and incremental approaches. We need more climate finance, and access issues needs to be addressed urgently, and which this organization continues to raise with the multilateral funds, in addition to what the PSIDs have been raising so far. Thank you, moderator.
Thank you very much, Philomena, for those remarks, and they were very important, especially the assistance through SPREP on the developing and of the adaptation and review of the national adaptation plans, and also your assistance to the Pacific in their efforts to access the Green Climate Fund. I'm also aware of the Pacific National Adaptation Guidelines. I think this will be very crucial guidelines for the use of development and review of NEPs in the countries. Thank you very much. The last question to the last panelist for today is Miss Yvette Kerslake, in your role as the technical advisor, Science to Service, and also including research for the Pacific Climate Change Center. Can you elaborate on the role of the Pacific Climate Change Center and how it relates to the Ipcc Pacific webinar and most recent findings that we introduced in the fact sheets in partnership with ANU? Thank you.
Malo Albito Ofa and Talofa Lava to all our distinguished participants online, and Malo Lava Leonusai to all our participants in the Pacific Climate Change Center. As you all may be aware, the vision of the Pacific Climate Change Center hosted at SPREP is to be a global, respected center of excellence, highly valued by our Pacific Island countries and territories. And also, as mentioned by the Honorable Minister of Natural Resources and Environment, our main aim is to provide practical solutions and actions to address our Pacific adaptation and mitigation priorities. Now, in saying this, the Pacific climate change is underpinned by strong partnerships with Pacific Island governments, international and regional organizations, as well as applied research institutions, donors, and the private sector. Now, these collaborations have led to innovative products, which we believe and we hope are contributing to the resilience in our Pacific Island countries and territories. Our main aim is to ensure to provide scientific, robust information on climate and meteorological science, and also on climate change impacts and responses. And we hope that this information directly supports more effective decision-making in our Pacific communities, or in simple terms, translating global to regional Pacific contexts and to apply it as suitable to the national context, or localizing this. As evidenced today, the Pacific Climate Change Center with SPRIP in partnership with ANU have taken you in a deep dive on the IPCC 6th assessment report and overview of impacts, adaptation, vulnerability for the Pacific. And we have also worked closely with ANU in developing fact sheets focused on the following 6 themes. Now, these fact sheets will provide you with short, quick pops of information and general messaging that you can be used by our Pacific Island countries as suitable at the national level. So we looked at thematic areas. As you can see in your chat box, we have provided the link to these fact sheets, and we'll also send an email after the webinar so you can access these. So we looked at different sectors, looking at food, health and well-being, infrastructure, how do we manage disasters? We even look at marine ecosystems, water and sanitation. And we also provide an overall infographic on today's webinar, but also on the IPCC working group report. Last year, in August 25th, we also partnered with ANU in providing you a webinar on the overview of physical science of climate change for the Pacific. And through this, we developed a fact sheet on infographic event, and this was used as a briefing document for our Pacific negotiations delegation at COP26. As our moderator has alluded to, the main objectives of these forums is we're looking at closing the knowledge gap of the Pacific region around the work of IPCC, and also to provide the most up-to-date synthesis of relevant climate change information. Last year, the Pacific Climate Change Center also partnered with Climate Analytics, and we also acknowledge our colleague Patty and our team from Climate Analytics and Ella. We had a closed forum for discussions with of the IPCC Working Group 2, which has now been launched, and also the upcoming Working Group 3, Mitigation for Climate Change Final Government Distribution. So we looked at the review of summary policy makers with a focus on key issues for our Pacific and SIDS. So main areas that we looked at is supporting participants in developing national comments and providing national feedback on the IPCC for the final government distribution. We also discussed what are the key challenges within this report and the modalities of the IPCC plenary to strengthen the Pacific. We're also planning our next webinar for the Working Group 3 once this report is also launched. As you may be aware, our Pacific Climate Change Center has 4 main functions: knowledge brokerage, research, innovation, and capacity building. And I'm pleased to inform you, under our capacity building project, we have our colleagues Masako and Yuji that is joining us now, that manage the Pacific Climate Change Center project for capacity building on climate resilience in the Pacific. We have extended opportunities for practitioners in Pacific Island countries and territories to enhance the capacity in sectorial areas. So courses are related. We looked at courses related to food sector, the water, tourism. We're also looking at in future at health. We looked at disaster risk reduction, but we also developed courses on ecosystem-based adaptation and mitigation. And we also have generic courses on accessing finances, and we're also developing further courses, as this is a priority within our Pacific Island countries. And from this, we see that there is a need to enhance our regional system to monitor and evaluate these long-term effects of climate change and the success of adaptation and disaster risk management interventions to manage these risks. So the Pacific Climate Change Center is working closely with our SPRIP climate change resilience and also acknowledge our Pacific MEC desk colleagues. We're looking at improving the flow of practical information between our Met services, our climate practitioners, our policymakers, our researchers, scientists, and also those who are implementing policies, programs, and projects at the regional level, but most importantly, at the national level. The Pacific Climate Change Center is committed to using the IPCC findings as the scientific basis, as Professor Mark has also presented on the feasibility studies that have come out of these reports, to provide services and products that can be used by our Pacific Island countries. And this is guided by the Roadmap for Strengthened Climate Services, the Pacific Island Meteorological Strategy, and also the Pacific Climate Change Science and Services Research Strategy. It is our belief and our understanding that the Pacific Climate Change Science to Services function will provide a gateway for the Pacific out of this climate crisis and more towards a sustainable future for our Pacific Island countries and territories. Thank you, Ofa.
Thank you very much, Yvette. I think that was well captured on the role of the Pacific Climate Change Center, and especially on science to services, but also research. And thank you for also introducing the other three key functions of the center. Colleagues, thank you very much. And I also like to thank the distinguished panelists today. We will now move on to the Q&A session. I can see there's already questions on the Q&A box. I would like to go straight into that, and because of the interest of time, we may be able to address at least 5 questions or 6 at the most. And the first question on our chat box is from Espen, and I think I would like to give this question for Mark to address. The question is, at the end of the IPCC sessions, there were attempts to introduce the issue of historical emissions. Do you consider this a serious consideration for the purpose of Working Group 2, or was this a politically driven issue? Over to you, Mark. Thank you.
Yeah, look, thanks, Ofa, and thanks, Espen, for the question. I'll be really quick in my answer, is that I don't think that was particularly a focus of Working Group 2, but I think it will be addressed within the Working Group 3 report, the emission reduction report. And so that is a key question about how to frame equitable emission reductions.
Thank you, Mark. Sorry, Mark, you will probably have to address the next 2 questions.
Okay.
How important is attribution science for specific extreme events like floods in Australia in removing the political inertia?
Look, I think in the case of the floods, people are already joining the dots between what they're seeing and climate change. And so, and even though we haven't had a formal attribution study of that, I think we're seeing that. And so, for example, the Prime Minister yesterday came out and made a comment and said, yes, the climate is changing in Australia, which really was the first time he's been, very explicit about that. So in a sense, that political message has already been received. But I think the attribution studies are also important for other reasons, and they're important because, for example, in relation to loss and damage, so understanding attribution of climate change to events then can actually be carried through into arguments about loss and damage. So how much of this loss and damage is essentially due to climate change? And I think it also is important in terms of giving us an enhanced understanding of the systemic elements of climate change. So rather than just focusing, say, on a climate variable, by doing attribution studies, we can take it into a much more full system understanding of what's going on.
Thank you, Mark. This question is actually got your name on it. Can you tell us why Fiji came out as having a positive stimulated impact to marine animal biomass?
Look, I actually don't know the answer to that one, and I have looked because I had the same question, but I haven't actually delved into it. I think it seems to be a couple of things. One is where we've got southerly migration of key species, such as tuna, and so they move from north to south in the southern hemisphere, and they're essentially accumulating there. And there's also elements there where as the oceans get colder, the impacts of things like ocean acidification change, and so we may see, maybe elements of that as well. But it's not entirely clear why we had that big splodge of green on those maps.
Thank you, Mark, and I would also like to add on that we also have the fact sheets that are available online. You can probably, get some of the answers from the fact sheet that has been shared widely. I would like to go now to PNG, to Chona. Limits to adaptation. If we cannot adapt because we are unable to access resources, should that be seen as loss and damage? Chona, yeah, thank you, Chona.
Yeah, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity again to, actually, I think there are limitations to adaptation, and and there are also options to look at how we can adapt. So I think in the context of PNG, we are looking at one of the options, which is looking at developing a climate mobility policy on track.
Sorry, I think we have a bit of connection with Chona.
Are you able to hear me now?
Yes, we can now. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Yeah, so I was just saying, with the context of, PNG, with some communities not being able to adapt to the changes that have been, that are occurring within the communities, one of the options is to look at, migrating from one place to another. So currently, in the country, we're looking at developing enabling frameworks like development of climate mobility policy for the government to look at and to implement, and to ensure that there's a smooth transition of communities from one place to another. So I guess it depends on the different circumstances that are that have been faced by the communities, and it's also good to look at other adaptation options that are available within their specific setting. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chona. We have two more questions to address, and I would like to pass the next question to Mark. To Luteru, and then perhaps Mark can also add on to this. Are ENSO events projected to increase in frequency and intensity?
Thanks, Ofa, and thanks, Ian, for the question. Obviously, projections of things like El Nino and La Nina are still very much active in the research domain. But what the research says at the moment is we're likely to see increases in intensity of both phases of the El Nino ENSO system. So that's increased El Nino intensity and La Nina, but not necessarily frequency. So increases intensity, but not frequency.
Would you like to add on to that, Dr. Luteru?
Well, depending on the location of each country, for example, the El Nino event can contribute and can cause more cyclones for the Samoan region and less cyclones for the Australian region, and likewise for the La Nina events. in terms of more rainfall intensity for some more La Nina events and things like that. So depending on the location of each country.
Thank you very much, Mark and Lutero. The next question is for you, Yvette. It was great to hear more about possible adaptation options, particularly ecosystem-based adaptation. Where do you think the biggest gaps are in EPA research in the Pacific?
Thank you, Ofa. I'd like to make reference to the Pacific Climate Change Science and Services Research Roadmap, which identifies the priority research of Pacific Island countries. And it also looks at climate change adaptation, mitigation, low carbon futures, which also includes ecosystem-based adaptation. This is quite a generic area, and also coming out of the outcomes of COP26, we also looked at thematic areas in general, like oceans. There is a need for more research in the Pacific, for more data and baseline within these areas that would help our Pacific Island countries to provide positions, and also to provide published articles or also published research in these areas in order to provide positions within our negotiations. But it's also important that we note that I think the biggest gap is baseline data. And as mentioned by Professor Mark today, we need a lot of feasibility studies. I generally believe that the success of projects and programs is built upon a well-developed concept of a project that is built upon baseline information that is available and credible, that has both quality and quantitative data. And this is one of the gaps that we are also looking at, working closely with our partners within SPRIP, our PACMEC desk, CCR, and also our other crop agencies. Another area that I also like to acknowledge our CCR team and also our PACMEC desk that they're also looking to, and which is applicable to our Pacific context, is traditional knowledge. And our team here at CCR and PACMEC desk currently developing baseline information on traditional knowledge. And I believe that given our Pacific context, traditional knowledge could also help us address this climate crisis in the future. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, colleagues. I'm really mindful of the time. We are now 4 p.m., which is we've gone overboard with the timing we put into the agenda. So I would like to inform you that the rest of the questions will be answered out of session, and we will send the responses and answers to all our colleagues. And also a kind reminder, participants, that we also have an evaluation survey in summary, and that will also be shared via email to you. The presentation by Mark will also be available and be shared with you in the next few days. Colleagues, I would like to bring this webinar to a close. It has been a pleasure to host you at the Pacific Climate Change Center here in Apia, but also online. And I would like to acknowledge our key partners to deliver this webinar, which is the Australian National University. Thank you, Mark, Mahelani, and Claire for the efforts in partnership with the Pacific Climate Change Center and SPREP to deliver this to our Pacific. Our participants from our member countries, the institutions, universities, I have USB students here, as well as government representatives. So thank you very much for availing your time to attend the IPCC report. I would also like to acknowledge the Minister for MNRE. He has left, but he was part of the discussion today. Thank you for his presence. So on behalf of the Director General of SPREP, Kosilatu, as well as the Director for Climate Change Resilience Program of SPREP, Tangaloa Kupa, and all of us here at the Pacific Climate Change Center, Faftai Tele Lava, Malo Aupito, and we will keep in touch. Kosi, or what would you like to say?
Ofa, you've
few
said
words?
everything that needs to be said. Just again, just a big thank you to everybody, and in particular to our presenters and the panel. Thank you very much to our colleagues from MNRE and the Minister. Thank you for being with us. We had a really good turn up. I had a look at the number of participants. It was almost 200, about 170 plus. So very good attendance. So thank you all, everybody. And enjoy the rest of the afternoon of time. Thank you.
Thank you. I will now close the session. Malo Aupito.
Thanks very much. Bye.